Good afternoon, and welcome to the Building Better from Disruption webinar series. We are so excited to have all of you with us this afternoon, and we are even more excited to have our featured speaker with us this afternoon, Dr. Shaun Harper. As many of you know, the Building Better from Disruption series was actually coordinated and put together so that we could learn from many of the lessons that have taken place over the last almost 2 years as it relates to the interruption that we've had related to the pandemic. So we are just excited to be able to have our featured speaker presentation today with Dr. Shaun Harper. And before I have an opportunity to formally introduce him to you, I'd like to share I am Dr. Cynthia Glover Woods, and I'd like at this time to introduce Dr. Carlos Ayala, President of Growing Inland Achievement. Dr. Ayala?
Thank you, Cynthia. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Ayala. I am the President and CEO of Growing Inland Achievement. It's a pleasure being here with you today. Growing Inland Achievement is a K-16 collaborative focused on creating economic prosperity in the Inland Empire by raising educational attainment levels. 2 years ago, we could not have imagined where we would be today in our educational systems. The pandemic has created unprecedented disruption and laid bare inequities that have plagued our nation's schools since prior to our founding as a nation. While all our student groups are struggling, what is most troubling is that some of our student groups, especially our Black, Brown, Indigenous, foster, homeless, and low-income students, are hardest hit. And of course, all these challenges have arisen during the national racial inequity reawakening that occurred after the murder of George Floyd in May of 2020, which has asked us to think deeply and act on our unjust political structures and societal systems, including our educational system. And that leads us to today, here and now, and these webcasts about how we can build better from disruption, an education system built to serve our students. Such as how to attend to the social emotional learning of our students by listening to the student voice, or how to attend to the social emotional needs of our teachers and staff. We recently heard from Nicole Anderson. She spoke to us about culturally relevant teaching and about connection before content. I want to thank the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation for the support of these webinars and learnings. Today, we consider an important component of our educational system, the systemic racism that exists. In what ways does racism impact our schools? It's a thing we think deeply about here at GIA. And so it's a pleasure to be here today to serve all of you and to listen to Dr. Harper. Cynthia, back to you.
Thank you so much, Carlos, and thank you for setting our why for this afternoon. Again, as I had mentioned at the very beginning, we're quite excited to have Dr. Shaun Harper with us and sharing with us this afternoon. Please let me share a little bit more about Dr. Harper, who is probably not a stranger to many of you who are joining us this afternoon. Shaun Harper is one of the nation's most highly respected racial equity experts. He is a Provost professor at the University of Southern California, Racial School of Education. He also is the Clifford and Betty Allen Chair in Urban Leadership, founder and executive director of the USC Race and Equity Center, and immediate past president of the American Educational Research Association. He also served as the 2016-17 Association for the Study of Higher Education president and was inducted into the National Academy of Education in 2021. Many publications such as the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and several hundred other news outlets have quoted Professor Harper and his featured research. Some of you might be familiar with research he did a few years ago called Succeeding in the City, which was a study on Black and Latino high school males and their success in high school to college. He also has been interviewed on many TV outlets such as CNN, ESPN, NBC News, Black News Channel, and NPR. and most recently has been on the Dr. Phil show just within the past month or so. We do want to also let you know that he is an advocate on a national level as well. He's testified twice to the United States House of Representatives and has spoken at numerous White House convenings. He also served on President Obama's My Brother's Keeper Advisory Council, on the National Education Policy Committee for the Biden-Harris campaign, and on California Governor Gavin Newsom's statewide task force on education, racial equity, and COVID-19 recovery. Dr. Harper is the recipient of dozens of top honors in his field and 2 honorary doctorates. He has been repeatedly recognized in Education Week as one of the 10 most influential scholars in the field of education. So as you can see, we are just blessed to be able to have such a renowned scholar, an expert with us this afternoon. We look forward to listening and we look forward to learning. So without further ado, I'd like to formally and virtually introduce to you Dr. Shaun Harper. Dr. Harper.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cynthia Glover Woods, one of my favorite educators in all of America, not just in Southern California. Cynthia, I am so grateful for everything that you do and continue to do and have done over the course of your career as an educator. I am so privileged to know you. Hello, everyone else, colleagues, friends. It's really terrific to spend this time with you. I was so excited when Cynthia reached out on behalf of GIA several months ago to invite me to be a part of this. It's such an important series, so it's not lost on me that you could have invited anybody to be with you here today, but you chose to invite me, so it really means a lot. And Carlos, thank you for framing our time together, so in such a spectacular fashion. We have a lot to do, not a lot of time to do it, so I'm going to jump right to it. We're going to be talking today specifically about racial equity, and I want to situate it in this particular moment in time. With the ongoing pandemic, I want us to think about how do we recover from what has been lost, the damage that has been done throughout the pandemic, right? I want us to begin to fast forward and imagine a point, hopefully in the not too distant future, when the pandemic, comes to an end. I want us to start to imagine the challenges that will await us as we, make our way through the stockpile of all of the inequities that were produced during this time. But to be sure, our time together today isn't just about these past 22 months. The truth is, there were way too many racial inequities before the pandemic. So I want to start there, actually. I would like us to do some quick collaborative and collective stock taking of racial inequities that were the reality for our schools and our districts before the pandemic. I just put in the chat a link to a Padlet. It's an anonymous form where I'm inviting you to just very quickly go and jot some of the pervasive racial inequities that existed in your schools long before the COVID-19 pandemic. And I want you to think specifically about racial inequities. So take a moment, the link is in the chat. You can also access it at uscrec.info/pre-COVID. Let's take about a minute and have you go and engage with the Padlet.
Also, as you're engaging with the Padlet, we are dropping a link to something called Pigeonhole in the chat, where you can upload some questions you have for Shaun that we're going to use at the end, and you can also vote on questions.
Great, thank you for that, Carlos.
Yeah.
All right, let's maybe take another 20 seconds. Another 10 seconds. Five seconds. Three, two, 1.5, 1. All right, because I'm a person who values inclusion, I couldn't help but see that some folks were still typing. So I wanted to make sure that I gave enough time. All right, so here's what I will do. When I send along the materials from today's session, I will be sure to include the output from this particular Padlet. I want us to keep top of mind, right, all of the racial inequities, or at least, some of the ones that you've noted here, that existed long before COVID-19 was a thing. So as we continue to make our way through the pandemic, and certainly in a post-pandemic recovery, we're going to have to walk and chew gum at the same time. We're going to have to obviously, recover from all of the things that happened over the pandemic, but we're also going to have to recover from these long-standing challenges that were realities in way too many schools and districts across the country. So, hey, thank you for contributing to the Padlet. Again, I'll be sure to send it along to Cynthia and others, at the conclusion of the session. All right, so we've established that we had racial inequities before the pandemic. In the interest of time, I'm just going to lift up here quickly 5 COVID-19 racial inequities. You all work in schools and in districts, and I saw that we had some colleagues here from Riverside Community College. Most of us are aware, I think, of the inequities that have been produced throughout the pandemic. So I only want to lift up 5 in the interest of time. The first of the 5 are the digital inequities. Certainly at the onset of the pandemic, when we were abruptly catapulted to remote teaching and learning, many of us came to realize that there were so many children of color, so many lower income children who did not have devices, who did not have reliable access to high-speed internet and Wi-Fi and so on. We continue to see throughout the pandemic, right, that those digital inequities are disproportionately continuing to affect students of color. Learning loss is a real thing. Responsible social scientists are working as hard as they can right now to figure out all the ways to reliably measure for us all of the learning that was lost. But one of the things that I know for sure from working with LAUSD and other districts throughout California and across the nation, those digital dropouts, the students whom many of us couldn't find when we went to remote teaching and learning, disproportionately, those students were Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and Pacific Islander students. Third, there was the horrific violence, the physical violence and attacks that we saw on Asian and Asian American and Pacific Islander persons throughout the pandemic. That violence undoubtedly had an emotional and psychological toll on our AAPI students and colleagues. It's a part of the pandemic that, frankly, I don't think we talk enough about. It wasn't just about the attacks, but imagine if your people were under attack, the psychological stress that ensues for you as you're attempting to, be a student or be a teacher or a school leader during that time, who's an AAPI person. Fourth, certainly the disproportionate exposure to risk among essential workers. The truth is, K-12 schools and districts, like just about every other industry in our economy here in America, tend to be incredibly stratified racially, meaning that the people who work in maintenance, groundskeeping, custodial, and food service roles disproportionately tend to be people of color. It's almost like a gradation in many districts. The higher you go, the whiter it gets. Throughout the pandemic, so many Latinx, Black and Indigenous and Pacific Islander persons still had to go to work in schools in one fashion or another, thereby disproportionately placing themselves at risk, and furthermore, having to return to their communities, to their households, in some instances, multi-generational homes having been exposed to the risk of the virus. And fifth, certainly, the disproportionate rates of infection and deaths among Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and Pacific Islander communities. Consequentially, as we welcomed our students and our colleagues back to our schools, disproportionately, it was people of color who had experienced the death of a loved one, a family member, someone in their community. Look, I could go on and on and on with the inequities that COVID-19 produced. Again, I know that you all are right there on the front lines, working in schools and in districts, so you know the other ones that are on the list. The point here, right, is that there's so much devastation that's been produced over these past 22 months. What we can't do in response to that devastation is what we were doing before. We cannot approach a post-pandemic racial inequity recovery with the same haphazardness and silliness, frankly, and ineffectiveness with which we attempted to approach racial inequities pre-pandemic. Here, I'm going to talk about 8 typical approaches to racial equity. These are pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, right now approaches that we here at the USC Race and Equity Center, unfortunately, see in schools and districts all across the country, as well as in our work with colleges and universities. So there are all of these racial inequities that show up in student achievement data or in employee turnover data and a myriad of other data sources. What do educators, perhaps well-intended educators, tend to do? Well, they tend to attempt to approach racial inequity in an imprecise and at times intentionally or deliberately raceless way. What do I mean by that? Equity is so on trend right now in California and throughout the nation. I hear it here, there, and everywhere. Everybody is saying our school or our district is so committed to equity. But if you ask 5 people who work in the district office, including the superintendent, what do we mean by equity? You're oftentimes going to get 5 very different answers, right? So there are these vague, imprecise declarations of a so-called, school-wide or district-wide commitment to equity without operationalizing what we mean by that. There's this other thing where there's like the equity dumpster, where everything gets dumped into it and race falls out at the bottom, and racial equity tends to be the thing that doesn't get enough attention. Why? Because folks are uncomfortable talking about race. They don't know how to talk about it. It's much easier to talk about, raising achievement for lower income students. I'm not saying that we ought not focus on that. We should. I was a very poor person growing up. Please focus on low income students. But what I am saying is that we cannot do equity without also a precise, unapologetic naming of racial inequities. What else do we do? Well, we attempt to solve 2021 and 2022 racial equity problems without proper attention to the reparation of historical negligence, violence, harm, and so on in years past. I remain absolutely convinced that we're going nowhere fast in our so-called relentless pursuit of equity in 2022 until and unless we also take stock of the damage that was done and the negligence that was done in 1982, 92, 2002, 2012, and now here we are in 2022, trying to correct racial problems. These problems and inequities did not emerge overnight. They emerged over time. So the treatment, right, the corrective action has to be one that honors reparations and takes a reparations stance and mindset. Third, many districts have these equity task forces. I like a good equity task force. I'm not saying don't have the equity task force. In many instances, it's too late. You already have them. But here's the thing. A well-intentioned equity task force will spend a year meeting, let's say 2 hours a month over the course of a 9-month academic school year. So that's 18 hours of meetings. Very smart people are on the task force. They spend 18 hours meeting and working on an equity plan for the district. Over 18 hours, spanning 9 months. They're talking about equity, and there's not a word about race, racism, racist cultures, policies, practices, curricula, people, right? How can I say this so declaratively, right? Well, it's because at times we here at the USC Race and Equity Center will go and spend a year observing an equity task force doing this work. They'll be at their task force meeting table and we'll be just in the corner, taking field notes. And, it doesn't surprise us that I guess, in August, nobody's talking about race. People just familiarizing themselves with the charge from the board or from the superintendent. Okay, fine. It's August, first meeting. It's October. Still no one's said a word about race. Oh, yikes. It's now suddenly February. It's Black History Month. Still ain't nobody talking about race. Okay. April, no. May, the task force is winding up its report. Seriously, over 18 hours, the equity task force has not said a word about race. Well, therefore, it shouldn't surprise you, I suppose, that the 88-page equity task force report that they deliver for the district says nothing about race. It's the production of a raceless equity report. My colleague Estella Ben-Simone, who recently retired from the USC Racial School of Education, Estella and I do a thing with equity reports. I admit to you that it is not all that rigorous, but she and I, continue to do this. It's quite helpful. We'll take an equity task force report from a school district or from a college or university. We'll open the PDF. We'll do a Control F. In the Finder window in the top right-hand corner, we'll type race, racial, racism, racist, Black, African-American, Chicano, Latino, Latinx, Hispanic, Asian, Asian-American, Indigenous, Native American, so on and so forth. The 88-page equity report returns no results, almost always. Now, where we do tend to see the names of the racial groups are in the data tables that are sprinkled throughout the report or included as appendices. It's those data reports that paint a quantitative picture for us, and they show us, on various student achievement indicators or, employee performance indicators, here's where we see the racial and ethnic gaps. But nowhere in the narrative of the report is there any sort of unpacking or analysis of that. There's a whole set of recommendations. For example, let's imagine that there's one particular indicator that shows us that it is Black girls who are most underserved by the school or by the district. There's a whole recommendation in the report about how to improve student achievement on that particular outcome, but it says not a word about Black girls, even though the table on page 87 very clearly shows us that it's Black girls whom we most underserve. Look, this is we are at the halfway point. We gotta stop doing these things in our approach and pursuit to equity, especially given the consequential nature of the COVID-19 racial inequities that await us. Let me give you 4 more. I'm gonna go a little bit faster here. There are these lopsided emphases on student deficits. I would also add family deficits. What's wrong with these students and their families and the communities that they come from? Lopsided emphasis on student talent and student effort. Too much emphasis, as a matter of fact, on what students do and on student engagement. Not enough emphasis on institutional responsibility. We know from a corpus of research, a corpus of well-informed practical approaches and practical guides and workbooks and videos and collaborative syllabi and all of this stuff. We know the things that lead to culturally responsive teaching and learning. We know the conditions that lead to a culturally relevant curriculum. The stuff has been produced. It gives us guidance on what it is that educators and school leaders and school staff members and district leaders ought to be doing. Way too many scholars, not way too many, but these are my friends. So many scholars have given us the directions, but yet when we're doing the equity work, it's all about how do we fix students and their families? Well, no, it ought to be how do we get our teachers and school leaders and staff members to do the things that we know lead to racial equity. We don't have to imagine what those things are. They're no longer hypothetical, right? They have been documented. A lot of the stuff is now publicly available, publicly accessible. But yet the equity task force and others engaged in equity work, throughout a district or in a school, don't tend to look inward at, wait a minute, what are we doing that potentially sustains or perhaps even exacerbates racial inequity? A couple more. Too little emphasis on dismantling classroom racism is what I call it. There are these efforts to sort of tinker around, inequities in a school. Yes, if we could create a new parent engagement program, I love a good parent engagement program. I'm not saying don't create the parent engagement program, but could you do that in addition to helping your teachers, bring, more culturally relevant and responsive teaching practices into their classrooms, right? Can you do something about the implicit biases that compel teachers and school leaders to disproportionately suspend and expel and discipline students from, particular racial groups, right? Those kinds of things and interactions happen in classrooms. And again, not enough emphasis in the equity plan is on classrooms. All right, 2 more. Sorry, I don't mean to insult you. I really don't, with the R word. But there really is no remediation of racial illiteracy among faculty, staff, and administrators in schools and districts. What I mean by that is the truth is few of us learned much, if anything at all, in our K-12 schooling experiences or in our college or graduate school experiences about race, about how to talk about race, about how to solve racial problems, about how to actually achieve racial equity, right? Very few of us learned how to do that. So there's this magical thinking that in our schools and districts, we're going to achieve racial equity just magically, just because we declare it so. No, we have to remediate. We have to remediate the illiteracy that occurred in other junctures in people's educational journeys, including the people on the Equity Task Force, by the way. All right, look, those are 8 ways. Well, no, that's just 7. There's one more. Sorry. Here's the last one. Yikes. We attempt to do racial equity in our schools with no data on the racial climate of our schools and the ways in which the racial climate specifically is experienced by students, parents and family members, as well as employees, teachers and staff and administrators within schools and districts. It can't be just student achievement data and test scores. I'm not saying we shouldn't focus on those things. We should. It can't be just attendance reports and truancy reports and those things. That's important. But we have to also understand experientially, how are people of color, students, staff and faculty and parents and so on, alike experiencing the climate of our schools. Otherwise, we're going to have an incomplete understanding of what's producing the inequities that we see in test scores and other student achievement and employee performance outcomes. All right, so I just told you what not to do. What might you do instead? Here's my favorite part. I'm going to share with you a handful of examples, and they're examples. They're not hypotheticals. They're not concepts anymore. I'm drawing from things that I have seen actually make a real difference in practice. Some of that stuff that I'm going to share with you, most of it is, work from the USC Race and Equity Center. But let me start by sharing with you some work from our governor's office. As Cynthia mentioned in her way too generous introduction of me, I had the privilege of serving on Governor Gavin Newsom's statewide task force on racial equity, higher education, and COVID-19 recovery. This particular task force was specifically focused on colleges and universities. But I think that there's so much about what we did and how we did it that's totally adaptable, even at a local level, to K-12 schools and districts. So I'm going to share with you some lessons from our statewide task force. There is a task force report. It is available publicly online. If you just simply did a Recovering with Equity Google search, you should be able to find it. But let me share with you some lessons from the task force that I think are totally relevant and adaptable. First, it had diverse sector representation. I forget the exact number of commissioners. Let's say there were 30 of us. That feels about right. There were folks from the UC, the CSU, the California community colleges, as well as me from the private university sector. There was that. There were also folks like Michelle Siqueiros from the Campaign for College Opportunity and, other activists and leaders and scholars and so on. So it wasn't just a random task force, right? It had folks that represented various stances and positionalities. I would argue that if you were developing a COVID-19 racial inequity recovery task force for your school or for a district, that you ought to have some custodial professionals on it. You ought to have some food service professionals on it, as well as teachers, as well as parents and family members, because those folks will help you understand in a much more multidimensional and comprehensive fashion the myriad ways in which the racial inequities affected, various stakeholders. So that was one thing that I thought worked really well about this particular task force. The other is that it was time bound. The governor wrote us all a letter, I believe it was in July of 2020, inviting us to serve on the task force, indicating that the work would begin in August and it would conclude in November, and that we were expected to deliver to the governor a report with concrete recommendations in November. Now, the truth is we were a little bit late. I think we delivered the report in January, but even still, right? We're talking 5 months, 5 very concentrated months. One of the things that I've learned over the years in working with districts on their equity task force plans and so on, is that sometimes they'll get it done in a year, but sometimes like folks are just like sort of inching along, kicking the can down the road from one year to the next. The governor's office said, you have 4 months, even though we took 6. So it was the time-bound engagement that forced us to be serious about getting the work done. That would be my recommendation for you. 4 months might be too short a window, but a year may be too long a window, especially given how urgent the recovery exercise is, right? Here's another. We relied on evidence for this particular task. We partnered with a consulting group that did some mixed methods gathering, data gathering for us through surveys, interviews, focus groups, and so on. That was really important. We didn't do campus forums or input sessions because we were still very much in the thick of the pandemic at that time. This was like pre-vaccines. So folks weren't gathering in large groups. So, that would be a takeaway, or an addition rather, for you, that if you were doing a thing for your district or for your school, in addition to, if you don't have the bandwidth to do surveys and focus groups, hire somebody to do it, right? But also have these forums, these community forums for parents and family members and community members, and input sessions where folks can give you input on the equity strategy. Otherwise, without input, it could be that a very smart group of people creates an equity strategy for the school or for the district. It's real smart, but it's not what the people need. It's not what the people want. And the people are like, yeah, if you had just asked us, we could have told you, 12 weeks ago that you should turn left instead of right. Actually, I think I just did that backwards. Left instead of right. In the treatments or the interventions that the group was identifying to recover from the racial inequities. Third, we were separated into what would be functionally the equivalent of subcommittees. So there were issue-specific work groups. Again, I can't remember the exact number. Let's say it's 30. The 30 of us were divided into 4 different subcommittees or work groups. There were times that we met together as a full task force, but there were also times that we met just within our issue-specific group. The point here is that you all put a lot of things on the Padlet. Plus, and again, those were pre-pandemic racial inequities. Plus, there are the inequities that the pandemic produced and exacerbated. That's too much. It's too much. The pile is too high for any one group of people, to tackle on its own. So having issue-specific work groups where one small subset of folks just work on this particular racial inequity and another group works on this one and so on, it worked, I think, really well for us on this particular task force. We never got overwhelmed as individuals because we were able to, break the work into sort of more manageable, even at times bite-sized pieces in these work groups. Another, we had to write something. there was the expectation from the governor's office that we would produce and submit a written plan. I talked earlier about the trendiness of equity, the imprecise nature of equity. There are way too many districts and schools that declare that they're committed to equity and that they're working on it. We're working on equity. We're so serious about it. Okay. I will ask them, can I see your equity plan? They're like, wait, no, we don't have a plan yet. Do you have any sort of strategy document? Nope. Like, I know that I talked earlier about the work that Estella Ben Simone and I do in, analyzing equity plans, right? But the truth is, way too many districts and colleges and universities will have these equity task forces without any expectation of the production of anything written. So I think one of the things that made this feel real for us as commissioners on the task force was that we had to produce something that we knew was going to the governor. If people know that they are having to produce something that's going to the superintendent and to the board, and that it's going to be made public on the district's website, there's a real chance that they might take the work much more seriously and do it with considerably more rigor. That was certainly the case for us. Let me give you just a couple more lessons from this particular exercise. We identified a set of immediate and long-term actions. That was really important, right? We had to think about, okay, we're in the midst of a crisis right now. The pandemic will end. I remain hopeful and optimistic that it will end. So we have to fast forward and imagine what's going to be on the other side of it in terms of the pile of racial inequities. But we also got to work on the racial inequities right now, right? So there was a both and, not an either or approach. There was a multi-pronged communication strategy when the report came out. Sorry that I'm doing this zigzag of, task forces for districts and colleges, like having a report, not having a report. Some have it, some don't. If you're going to claim to be serious about equity, you got to, in racial equity specifically, you got to have a report. Look, you also have to make sure, though, that that report makes its way into the hands of every teacher, staff member, professional, administrator, into the hands of the board, the public, so on. You have to. That was a part of the work with the governor's task force. There was such a robust, multidimensional, very aggressive even communication strategy to communicate across the state the work that had been done, the agenda that had been set, and the actions that it would take to recover from the inequities that were produced and exacerbated. All right, so those are the lessons, some lessons at least. I want to share with you as I begin to turn the corner toward completion and opening it up for discussion. I want to talk about some work that we do here at the USC Race and Equity Center and some lessons that we've learned from that work that I think are scalable, replicable, and so on. First, I'm going to talk about our Racial Equity Leadership Academies with the Los Angeles Unified School District. Back in October 2019, which feels like a decade ago at this point, but in October 2019, LAUSD Superintendent Austin Buettner and I had a press event here at USC in which we announced the creation of a partnership between LAUSD and the USC Race and Equity Center in what we were calling the Equity Leadership Academies for principals. Education Week picked it up, wrote an article about it. That article is publicly accessible on the Ed Week website. But as you can see here from the headline, principals to get specialized training to tackle racial inequities in their schools. When then Superintendent Buettner and I made the announcement, we thought that the inaugural cohort would be for 40 principals. And it says 40 in the Ed Week article. But actually, when we launched the Academy, because the demand was so high among principals, we doubled the size. So there were 80 principals. I'm going to drop here in the chat for everyone a link that gives you more details into the actual academies, as well as some of the other work that we're doing with local K-12 school districts throughout Southern California. So I'm going to go a little bit fast here. Here's some things about the Academy and our efforts to strengthen racial literacy among school leaders and teach them how to lead on racial equity with much higher levels of skillfulness. So the inaugural cohort was for 80 principals across the district. 6 months later, we launched a second academy for what LAUSD calls its communities of schools administrators. There were 40 of them. These are administrators who support, sometimes 10 or 20, principals. So they're kind of like an intermediary between principals and local area superintendents. But the point here is that there were 40 of those. So in the first year of this partnership, there were 120 LAUSD administrators who participated in the academies. The academies included 10 professional learning sessions. Each of those sessions were 3 hours, and each session was on a different and specific racial equity topic. Again, it was here that we were attempting to teach principals things about racial equity that they didn't learn in their principal certification programs or in their teacher ed programs when they were teachers, right? And it was all about the practice, not the theory, not abstract or philosophical notions, but how do you roll up your sleeves and solve complex racial equity problems and challenges in your schools? So there were it was 30 hours of professional learning for those principals and the COSAs over the course of the series. In addition to the professional learning, all 120 of these school leaders and district level leaders created strategic racial equity projects with expert coaching and extensive feedback from our team. So we said to the principals, for example, at the kickoff, we want you to come with one vexing racial equity challenge or opportunity in your school. Over the course of this year-long academy, we're going to support you in developing a strategic action plan to solve that problem or to seize that opportunity to advance and improve racial equity. And again, we gave them lots of feedback and coaching, and that feedback and coaching continues. Even now in winter 2022, we're still coaching and providing feedback to those principals and school leaders. We may have just had ourselves a good old-fashioned super spreader event. The first academy for those 80 principals kicked off in person on March 5th, 2020. Literally just a week before, we all very abruptly were catapulted to remote teaching, learning, and working. We had all these folks here gathered in a space on the USC campus. Obviously, the original design for the academy was to have 10 in-person day-long experiences where half the day would be spent doing the professional learning and the other half of the day would be spent doing the strategic equity projects. Obviously, we had to pivot to a virtual format for the duration of the series because of the pandemic. And I just want to say, right, that from the start all the way through his transition out of the superintendency, that the superintendent was meaningfully involved, such a spokesperson for the work. There's an implication here for all of us that it can't be just the equity task force who messages how important this is and how consequential it is for the school or for the district, it can't be just a handful of principals or a handful of people of color. It has to also be the superintendent, right? It has to be that person's leadership team who, all sings from the same song sheet about how consequential and important this work is. We found that in our partnership with Austin. So the major takeaway here for you as you think about, recovering from the pandemic produced inequities, as well as the inequities that were there pre-pandemic, is that you got to create a serious experience, a rigorous experience that upskills leaders in the practice of racial equity. Now, it shouldn't be just leaders, right? I mean, leaders are ultimately responsible, but it can't and shouldn't be just leaders, which leads me to some implications from some of the lessons that we've learned in our work with the Inglewood Unified School District. We designed for IUSD a year-long all-employee racial equity learning series. Let me quickly tell you a little bit about it. This particular series was open to and continues to be open to every teacher, staff person, school leader, and district office administrator all across the entire Inglewood Unified School District. So it's an entire district-wide professional learning series. Every month, they're live, synchronous, 90-minute, virtual, practically useful, focused on practice, not focused on theory and concepts and philosophies, but focused on practice sessions for all of these professionals and educators who work across the district. The sessions indeed are evidence-based and practically useful, and again, very engaging. The sessions were developed and delivered by our nation's most highly respected experts on racial equity in K-12 schools. Some of those folks work right here in the center, but we also commissioned, folks from the field, people like Tyrone Howard across town at UCLA. Gloria Latson-Billings from University of Wisconsin-Madison is on our K-12 bench of folks who design and deliver, sessions for us. Folks like Yolanda Seeley Ruiz at Columbia University, Chris Emden, who was at Columbia University, but now is at USC. He joined us on January 1st. Those are just some examples of folks who are on our roster of K-12 experts who, who designed and, ultimately, teach these professional learning experiences for us, both in the Inglewood series as well as in the LAUSD series. Those 3-hour sessions for the principals and COSAs were designed by, many of those same folks. We have a menu here in the center of racial equity learning topics that we give to districts and schools that want to partner with us. We gave that menu to Inglewood and they chose their topic slate. You see it here, or at least, yeah, you see it here. That's all of them. I thought this might have been an abbreviated set of topics, but I think this is the whole slate. You'll notice that there are 9 sessions instead of 12. It's because we take the summer off, obviously. But the point here is that every month there is a learning experience for every employee of the district that's focused on a different racial equity topic, including one of my favorites was the one from March 2020, teaching the truth about slavery and America's racial history. How do you do that? And how do you especially do it in this politicized moment where very misinformed people are suggesting that critical race theory is being taught to 5th graders? Critical race theory is not being taught to 5th graders. It's not a thing. In fact, in 2 weeks, our center is launching a national campaign that tells the truth about teaching about race and so on. But the point here, right, is that imagine everybody in a district coming together for 90 minutes to actually learn how to do this and how to do everything else that you see here on the screen. It is a thing that for sure is required if we are going to, really advance and sustain racial equity. We got to teach the people who are supposed to be the advancers and sustainers how to advance and sustain. We ought not presume that, again, that magically they just know how. How would they know if they were never taught anywhere else in their educational or professional upbringing? I'll end here by saying that inasmuch as I love this work that we're doing with Inglewood, and that is all district, I'm also a big proponent of the work that we do in our 2 higher ed alliances. We have not formed an alliance yet like these in our K-12 portfolio. It's a thing that is certainly top of mind for us. But let me tell you here quickly, in summer 2020, shortly after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, we brought together 68 community colleges all across the state of California to form a racial equity leadership alliance. In part, we did that because many college presidents during that time were reaching out to the center for advice on what do we do in the moment? How do we write a statement about George Floyd's murder? What do we do? And I was like, no, it's not just about writing a statement now during this time when it's so fashionable and trendy to do so. You got to take the long view. It can't be just you declaring that racism is bad and that Black Lives Matter. It can't be that, right? So we formed, again, what we call the California Community Colleges Racial Equity Leadership Alliance. It brings together 68 community colleges across our state. 6 months later, we formed an alliance of 71 liberal arts colleges in every geographic region of the United States, not just California, even though there are some California liberal arts colleges, but everywhere else in America as well, 71 liberal arts colleges. Across the 2 alliances, we do 3 things. First, we do monthly professional learning experiences. These are 3-hour virtual synchronous learning experiences, and each college gets to send 10 employees. And then we very quickly make the materials from those sessions available to everybody at the colleges, not just the 10 people who came. And every month, different racial equity topic, and we're literally teaching people how to do racial equity, how to solve racial problems. What I love about these 2 alliances is that folks are learning together, but they're also learning from each other. As you might imagine, our instructors don't talk endlessly for 3 hours. That would be torture. So there are lots of engagement opportunities. As you might imagine, like, folks are bringing like really helpful concrete examples from their campuses. They're also putting resources in the chat and so on. So it ends up being, a really, really, really robust 3-hour experience. On average, at the end, we always ask the same poll question before we let everybody go at the end of the 3rd hour. The poll question is, I found today's session practically useful. On average, across the now 14 months that we've been doing this, on average, 94% of the attendees agree that they found the session practically useful. 4% on average say they're unsure. There are people like me who are like, wait, this just ended. I'm still making up my mind. I'm a reflective person. I don't know yet. I'm still making up my mind. But only 2% of folks are like, no, this wasn't practically useful. So that's a real point of pride for us to deliver to folks practically useful professional learning experiences. That's one thing that all 138 member institutions across the 2 alliances do. Quickly, they also are all doing our campus climate survey, our national campus climate survey. Remember, I told you that one of the 8 typical approaches to racial equity within a district or school or within a college or university in this context, is that folks attempt to do racial equity without climate data. Like, no, you're going nowhere fast. So all of these colleges are doing our climate survey, and we're providing them the data and recommendations back. And the third thing is that we've constructed a portal, a virtual engagement portal that is chock full of equity resources, but so there's that downloadable equity resources, but it also allows people to form groups. So we're just launching this portal at the end of this month. In fact, I'm getting the preview, the final sort of preview, pre-launch preview of it tomorrow. But, imagine across the 68 community colleges in California, a group of math faculty forming a virtual group, Math Faculty for Equity, that kind of looks and feels like a Facebook group, but in that group, they're able to pose problems of practice, share resources and advice, and so on about how do you teach race and racial equity in math? How do you make the math classroom and curriculum culturally responsive, culturally sustainable, and so on? So, look, the point here is that, again, I love this single district, all employee experience that we offer for Inglewood, but I also love that we've been able to bring so many colleges together throughout our state and across the country to learn with and alongside and from each other. Those are the things that racial equity require. That's what recovery from the COVID-19 racial inequities and the pre-pandemic inequities require. I hope you found those examples useful. I'll stop here and turn it back over to Dr. Cynthia Glover Woods for what I hope is a really robust Q&A. Hey, thank you all again for inviting me. It was a real treat to spend this time with you.
Well, I tell you, the treat was ours, Dr. Harper. I appreciate you giving and imparting some of your knowledge to us. Definitely an hour is not enough time, but you gave us some really good things to think about and reflect on. I do have a couple of questions for you. I'll let you get your hydration in and whatnot as I pose the questions. One of the things, and you started our conversation with really acknowledging how equity has become almost the flavor of the month. I reflect back to, I believe it was 2014, 2015, when we in Riverside County started the Excellence Through Equity Conference. And you have been a guest speaker a couple of times with us there. But as the years have gone on, almost 10 years now, equity has become an educational buzzword. And as a result, there is just a misunderstanding of what it is, and everybody's doing equity, quote unquote, doing equity. So my question to you is kind of related to this knowing doing gap that we have. That's part of the issue. As you mentioned, the information on how to provide those culturally relevant classrooms are there, how to best engage in conversations around racial inequities. The examples are there. We know a lot of things, we're not doing them. What examples have you seen that allow for schools, districts, or county offices to actually go from knowing what should be done to doing it, implementing, and being held accountable for the implementation?
Yeah.
So I've given you a lot there, and I apologize for so many words, but at the bottom line, Dr. Harper, how do we get to the doing? And what examples have you seen of people actually implementing what they've talked about and written and being held accountable for it?
Yeah, I love this. Thank you for all of it. Let me start with the knowing doing gap. I said earlier that so many gifted practitioners and professionals have produced, lots of open access content for us. Certainly lots of scholars who are very good at translating. Some of us are better at that than others. But, folks like Gloria and Pedro and Tyrone and, those household names, while we have written the guidebooks with lots of clear guidance, and a teacher or school leader can go and buy those things or access them, Cynthia, it would sort of be like me going and buying a physics book and attempting to teach myself physics. I never took physics in high school or college. I don't know a thing about physics. So just because the textbook is available on Amazon and I could have it at my house tomorrow, when I get it, I wouldn't know what to do with it. I will be running myself in circles trying to figure out what in the world is this physics book doing. And I'm a very smart person, right? Here's the point. We have to, the knowing doing gap is not going to close itself. We have to, in a very formal way, set a table for folks to come and learn. We have to establish a curriculum, a professional learning curriculum for educators and education professionals. It can't be a one-off implicit bias workshop. Like, wow, wasn't that PD great? Like, we actually don't use the word or the acronym PD here, because we don't think of anything that we do here as merely PD. We got to go like professional learning and skill building and strategy and reparations, you know, like that stuff, that's serious work. We got to teach people how to do that stuff. Otherwise, they're not going to know how to do it. And, you know, for the examples, right, that you're calling for, you know, I try to be not too proud, because I recognize that, you know, being too proud is not a great thing. But I'm so proud of those equity leadership academies that we did in collaboration with LAUSD, because our theory of change there was that we're going to teach and upskill these principles and these COSAs while simultaneously giving them a framework to create change projects, change efforts. You know, in the design, and I'll wrap up here, in the design of their strategic racial equity project plans, it started with what is the challenge or opportunity? What's going to be the intervention or the set of, you know, corrective activities, policies, practices, programs, whatever. So design, implementation, resourcing, assessment, accountability, sustainability, institutionalization. I feel like there's one other part that I'm missing, but notice how that doesn't sound like a flimsy 2-pager. It sounds like a real concrete, like in lots of ways, Cynthia and colleagues, in lots of ways, like a turn-by-turn playbook on how we're going to solve this particular racial equity challenge. That we need more of that. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Well, no, you are right there. And I have to tell you, during this last hour, I feel like I've been in the amen corner. I've been talking to myself in this room. One of the downfalls of a virtual setting, but everything you say, I so definitely agree with. And my takeaway from your response is anyone who is truly interested and truly committed to doing the work around equity, which is inclusive of having to address issues of race, must be willing to do that deep dive. It's more than a workshop, it's more than a series of a couple of sessions together. And I appreciate that. Some of the questions we received wanted to really hear some more detail and examples for some of the things you mentioned. So for example, reparations. You mentioned that at the beginning and just a few moments ago. Can you give us a little more detail into what reparations might be? What does that look like in our educational space?
Sure. The implications of this are admittedly more at the board level than at an individual school level. So let me start there. Let me also say that, you know, there's the one style of reparations that is perhaps familiar to many of us. that style of reparations entails making direct payments to descendants of enslaved African peoples and indigenous peoples here in the United States. I'm all for it, right? Like I am very much a proponent of that brand of reparations. But the brand of reparations that I talk about in the context of education requires us in our budget to earmark dollars for outreach, relationship formation, relationship repair, programs, services to communities that we have long left behind, communities that have long been harmed at times, certainly excluded way too often by our district and by our schools. It requires, if I'm going to go back to my Black girls example, if the data on page 87 of the equity report tells us that it's Black girls that we're most disadvantaging and underserving on this particular student outcome metric, to repair that harm, here's the reparation. We got to put money in the budget for specific interventions that are targeted at Black girls. And if anybody tries to come at you and say, well, why are you doing that? Because the data table on page 87 tells us that it's Black girls who are needing this investment. And it's not that Black girls are genetically broken, disadvantaged, or genetically predisposed to disadvantage. No, please. It's that we have not created the appropriate structures, support systems, and conditions to ensure the success of Black girls on this particular outcome. And look, it could be that the data table on page 87 was sort of one blimp in time. Okay, well then go back and look at that same metric last year, the year before, 5 years before that, 10 years before that. I guarantee you, I promise you, if you do that, you are going to see a very consistent trend across various student outcomes and employee outcomes. It's going to be very clear that, yikes, we have been in a very chronic fashion disadvantaging, underserving, and so on, these different groups. That's where you got to put your programmatic and your financial resources. That's what I mean by reparations in the context of an education system.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to ask a question, Cynthia, may I?
Yes, please do.
I thank you for that notion about reparations. Here at GIA, we're a K-16 collaborative in the IE. We bring a consortium together to work on improving education. And one of the things that we talk a lot about is removing obstacles for all students, and at the same time providing strategic scaffolding for certain groups of students to move forward. And I'm understanding that that's what reparations means in your language. One of the things we're also learning, Shaun, is that we're learning the importance of elevating student voice in this work. We've one of the things that we have done in the region is we found ways to provide students in secondary and elementary and in post-secondary spaces opportunities to lead and opportunities to talk about what is impacting them. What are some of the practices that you are familiar with connecting this idea of elevating the student voice with equity? Do you see some good work throughout the nation that we could learn more about, and any specific strategies we may want to consider locally?
Sure. I'm certain that there are tons of great examples across the nation. I'm going to talk about the ones that are most familiar to me because I could talk about them most in depth. So we launched in December. That was just a month ago. Last month, we launched a commission on racial equity in California community colleges. And the commission has 30 commissioners 8 of those commissioners are students. There are also community college presidents, deans of various things, faculty, our academic senate, chairs. But one of the things that we made very clear to everybody in the first commission meeting is that these student commissioners have the same authority, the same voice as the presidents in the group. They're not mere ceremonial appointees. They're not the student members. They're full-fledged commissioners like everybody else. I think saying that to everybody, help them to not undervalue the expertise that these students were bringing, because the truth is students are most expert on their own experience than are the rest of us. But so it did that. But the other effect that it had is that it totally empowered those students to not sort of defer to the administrators and the faculty members, but they felt like they were on par. That's one example. I'll give you another. It's one of my favorite things, as a matter of fact. When I was at the University of Pennsylvania, the birthplace of our center, we were the Penn Race and Equity Center before we moved to USC. When we were the Penn Race and Equity Center, we did a convening in collaboration with the White House. It was a national summit on educational excellence for African American students. Folks came from all over the country. We decided that the panels throughout the weekend were all going to be young people, all students. And we're going to have the students tell us what it is that would make their schools equitable and inclusive, right? We, as you might imagine, like lots of educators and adults go to lots of convenings and things, right? And there are these panels of like so-called experts like me. Honestly, folks walked away from that White House summit that we hosted on the Penn campus. They walked away with so much guidance because we created a way for them to hear students that had not been created before, right? So we got to do more of that. We got to do more of that.
Thank you.
Let me say about that, actually. So I did note that Chris Emden joined us from Columbia University on January 1st. He's a professor in the Racial School of Education here, but he's also our center's inaugural director of youth engagement and community partnerships. I know for sure anybody who knows Chris Emden knows that he is a youth engagement. I mean, it's his thing. So I imagine, very shortly here at the center that we're going to be creating more systems and platforms and so on to receive and hear student voice. Maybe now, Carlos, is the time for me to, and I want to do it before our time runs out. I mentioned in passing that our center in about 2 weeks from yesterday, we're launching this national campaign on truth teaching. In some ways, it's in response to the well-coordinated national attack on critical race theory. Let me say one more time, people are not teaching CRT to second graders, fifth graders, high schoolers. It's just not a thing, right? But it has become a thing politically, right? Think about the Virginia governor's race, the incumbent who was a Democrat. His opponent was running television commercials suggesting that he wants to teach your children critical race theory. It's absolutely absurd, right? So look, we're launching this campaign to first counter myths and misconceptions about CRT being taught in elementary, middle, and high schools. But more importantly, the larger goal of the campaign is going to be, to energize the nation about learning the truth about America's racial past and present, and we're connecting it to democracy. Our democracy depends on people knowing the truth, right? So part of that campaign is going to involve, lots of like material assets and apparel and hashtags and social media filters and all of that stuff. Part of it is going to also be like a set of materials for students, for student activists. I imagine all across the country, students and student activists wearing t-shirts in our K-12 schools that say, "Teach me the truth," right? That will be, I think, another role that young people can play in helping us deliver to them a curriculum and a set of learning experiences that they deserve and that our democracy deserves.
That is so powerful.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Carlos, you were jumping in again.
No, I was just
My
saying,
apologies.
I'm looking forward to learning more about that campaign and finding ways that we can collaborate with you and your center on distributing that out. I hope to have students with those shirts on soon.
And with their posters. Like these ridiculous people are like showing up to school board meetings, like saying, "I don't want you teaching my child critical race theory." Ain't nobody teaching your child critical race theory. Stop it. I want the counter protesters to be young people with posters that say, "Teach me the truth, please." That's all I ask. Teach me the truth. T-shirts, posters, buttons, flags, all the things.
Cynthia, do we have time for another question before we close?
We do. We have time for a couple of questions, actually.
Oh, okay. So Shaun, one of the things that the governor is doing is that he's putting money where his ideas are, and he's finding ways to take the recovery with equity report and instantiate it in some programs. And one of the things that he's proposing is the formation of K-16 collaboratives, regional efforts to support education and improve economic conditions in particular regions. And the Inland Empire is organizing around that work. Can you provide some guidance to us about using the report to help set priorities for carrying on our recovery in the IE with an equity focus?
And with the K-16 lens, yeah. This is a good question. I do a thing a lot, actually, in my work with districts and with higher ed institutions too. But let me stay focused on districts for a second, where I will take a report like the California one, the one that we produced from this task force. I will take it to Tennessee. And I'll say to Tennessee, clearly, you're not California. Let's start there. I get it. I'm not suggesting to you that this is a just add water exercise and I want you to do everything that Californians. It's not going to work, right? There's going to be a violent allergic reaction across the state of Tennessee. But the point here, right, is let's go through the report all together and let's highlight and identify what can be done in Tennessee, what can be adapted to your local context, to your political context. So I would suggest in that same way, breaking down the report and thinking about in a local or in a regional, in the IE, how do we take this stuff that was thought about sort of in a statewide prism? How do we take it and adapt it for our regional context? How do we also identify here opportunities for, P16 or P20, partnership? I got to tell you that honestly, we were not thinking as deeply about P20 possibilities because we were trying to stay very focused on the post-secondary charge. But that doesn't mean, though, that there aren't K16 or P20 possibilities. I think that you all just need to go through it, break it down, and identify what is possible to fit, the framework of your collaborations. I think that's the best I can do on that one, Carlos.
No, that's very insightful. Thank you. That's a good approach. Actually, gives us a point of engagement too, to have that conversation. One of the things I've learned in this work is that you have to bring people to the table, and you have to start talking about these things, and use these frameworks as opportunities to create this, discussion, and to lower the barrier so we can start talking about race. We can start talking about the inequities that exist. It's hard work.
Yeah. Carlos, something just occurred to me. I wasn't satisfied with my response. But I think this might be the answer. This is what I ultimately think should be done, right? If you follow this same sort of procedural, it's not just procedural, but if you follow these lessons in creating your own, recovering with equity, strategy for the IE, I think, and you do it in a K16 way, you all should be sort of mindful all throughout, all right, how can we be sure that what we're creating, we can connect to, budget possibilities or investment possibilities in the governor's budget? So in other words, it might be that you're not trying to take this and break it down and force fit it into your regional context, but it might be that you instead use these methods that we use to develop the report, and then you think strategically about how do we align this with things that are in the governor's budget and investment, like very obvious linkages. That way you fashioned something that really is, really most appropriate for your context.
That's a much.
And Shaun, I will. Shaun, I would add in, as you had placed up there, some of those steps, a couple of very key ones when you think about that collaborative across really TK-12 through our community colleges and our universities, that collaboration around the mixed methods data gathering process, very, very huge. Many of our universities in Riverside and San Bernardino counties have partnered with districts or county offices to run focus groups with students. Also could be done to really go across the community, that diverse sector collaboration. And then again, looking at some of those issue specific equity groups and really looking at those areas that are of critical nature, and there's so many in our region, and really pulling together the collaboration around that. So I, again, just applaud and underscore. Carlos, thank you so much for such a pertinent question. And Shaun, thank you so much for, again, kind of guiding us. One of the takeaways I have from what you said is it's not a just add water and go. And physics books will never look the same to me, because you've given me an example of how we don't just get a book and think we can do it. You really have to do a deep dive and have support from experts to build our expertise. We do have one question. I know we're at our time, but I want to be sure to ask one of the final questions that came from the panelists, and also to let everyone, all of our participants know that there is a survey link that will be placed in the chat for you momentarily if it hasn't already been placed there. Actually, it has been placed there for you to please give feedback to us on this session and any other things that you would like for us to know. So, Shaun, the question that came forward kind of almost goes back to that remediation of the racial illiteracy, and it aligns to that climate of truth you spoke about. At times, there are very differing interests of the students and the interests of the faculty and the teachers and staff that are on campus. What strategies do you recommend to work through some of those differences? And I'll add a little footnote to that, Shaun.
Yeah, I need that footnote. So I appreciate that.
Sometimes my guess, there's no scientific research behind this, but sometimes I believe the failure to address race in the equity conversations is because it begins to unearth a lot of things that people are not very comfortable or equipped to deal with, especially in those differing opinions. So when there are differences of opinions, from either the students to the faculty, or from the parents to those in the school system, how might we approach an end to that?
I would say I'm going to start in a very simplistic place, and then perhaps I'll get more complex. I would say that more dialogue as opposed to less is definitely what we want. But the truth is, when it comes to racial inequities and racial issues, avoidance is what we do most. We don't talk. It's the exact antithesis of dialogue. We're definitely going nowhere fast, with that particular approach. So that would be my first response. My second, and here's where I'm going to start to make things just a little awkward and uncomfortable for at least one person, at least. I'm putting into the chat right now two things. The first thing is a link to a 9-episode series that I did last year. Among my many jobs, last year I was named an editor-at-large of Time magazine. In my role as editor-at-large, I did this 9-episode series on race in the workplace. As Cynthia told you all, I'm a professor in 2 schools here, education and business. While this 9-episode series is mostly focused on corporate context and workplaces outside of education, the truth is, and this is no exaggeration, the truth is at least 85% of what I talk about there in the corporate workplace also happens in the education workplace, at least 85%. My point in raising this and pointing you to the series is completely open access. You can go and watch it alone. You can watch it with your colleagues. But my point in including it is that the very people who are supposed to do something about the racial inequities, what if there are inequities between and among them? What if there are racial tensions between and among them, right? Like folks who work together in the county office or at the district office or in the school. I have no confidence at all that, folks who have racial beef with each other are going to somehow, be able to just magically put that aside and achieve racial equity for students. Not enough attention is paid to workplace inequities, workplace racial inequities, racism in the workplace. So I think we got to start there, right? Like this is a part of we need more conversation and more dialogue, not less. we got to get honest about, the racial tensions and toxins and inequities, among those of us who work in these places, if indeed we are expected to deliver on what it is the students are expecting and demanding of us. Yeah, that's the best I could do for a response while I was multitasking. I put another thing in the chat. I just put a PDF of the slides. So you can download it right here directly from the chat. The slides include a screenshot of the output from the Padlet. So it's embedded in the PDF. Look at me multitasking. But yeah, it's right there. And I will also send it along to Cynthia and others, just so they have it for the archives or files or whatever. All right.
Well, I appreciate that. And you always use the phrase, this is the best I can do. I'm going to tell you your best is awesome, because you have given us, again, just a lot of things to reflect upon as we, as the adults in the system, have to close that knowing doing gap, and how we need to move to action and not shy away from the very difficult conversations about race when we are having those dialogues around equity and that work. So I applaud you. I thank you so much, Shaun, for just giving us an hour or so of your time today, over an hour and a half, to really help us in the Riverside and San Bernardino County area and abroad do what we know needs to happen for students. And the way that we do is by really listening and implementing some of the items you shared with us today. So thank you so very much for that. Carlos, would you like to give the closing words as we get ready to close out for today?
First, I'd like to start by thanking Shaun for his time today. Much appreciated. I want to thank Cynthia for providing a level of professionalism to this webinar series. This is the last of our series. And so thank you so much, Cynthia. And I want to reach out to my colleagues and at the San Bernardino County Superintendent of Schools Office, as well as the Riverside County Office of Education. This webinar series was a collaborative effort with Mickey Embody and Amanda Corrigan and others in creating a space to have difficult conversations about how we build from the disruption that's occurred. And I look forward to further engagements and opportunities in collaborations with both county offices and the school districts. I put in the chat an invitation for folks to participate in our IE-wide conversations around a K-16 collaboration. We're building a consortium that is focused on improving the economic viability of the IE through education, with particular focus around finding the right kind of pathways for students to lead them to good careers. And in that process, we need everybody's voice at the table. So please participate in that upcoming event on Friday. It's Friday at 10 a.m. And I dropped it in the chat there. But with that, I want to just thank you again, Cynthia, and I'll give you the last word.
Well, thank you, Carlos. My last word will be very, very brief. Again, hope that today was something that you can build off of. We're very good in education about making plans and convening, but we need to be about action. And Dr. Harper's conversation with us today, as well as the other series sessions that we've had, are just about that. Let's move into action. Let's do what the children in the IE need us to do as the adults in the system. And thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this. And I wish everyone not just all the best, but I wish you action and purpose as we serve our students. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you all.